This episode is brought to you by my very first book, The Fifth Vital Sign: Master Your Cycles and Optimize Your Fertility. With over 1,000 research citations, it is the most comprehensive resource on fertility awareness and the menstrual cycle to date. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/vitalsign for a free sample of the first chapter. That's fertilityfriday.com/vitalsign. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 244. Welcome to the 244th episode of the Fertility Friday podcast. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Lisa from fertilityfriday.com, and this is your source of information about the fertility awareness method and all things fertility. I'm excited to share today's episode with you. And I know I always say that, but I always am. So I feel like it's appropriate to say it nearly every single time I record an episode for you. But in today's episode, I wanted to do some real talk, really, about using fertility awareness for birth control. I recently had a really interesting conversation with Dr. Marguerite Duane, and we were chatting about some of the complexities of fertility awareness and really just some of the unique challenges to a user-dependent method. And so when it comes to birth control, there's two broad categories, user-dependent methods and non-user-dependent methods. And what that means is that some methods of birth control, the most common ones that we're familiar with, some methods of birth control don't require you to do anything, really. So for instance, the IUD is a good example of a non-user dependent method because, you go to your doctor, you have it inserted, and then you don't have to do anything. It's completely hands-off, and, the birth control aspect of it is just there. And so therefore, any failures, and there are always failures with any type of birth control, I think that's always really important to reiterate. So any failures related to the IUD use, meaning, pregnancies that were obviously not planned because that's why you had the IUD inserted in the first place. Any pregnancies are directly related to a failure of the device itself. So that would be a method failure, because the method didn't work. But in terms of effectiveness, then with IUDs, the effectiveness rate is typically right up there in the 98-99% range because you can't do anything to mess it up. Really and truly, if there's a failure, it's not because you didn't do something. And other, methods of hormonal birth control would fall into that category. So for instance, like the implant or the shot. So, other than not going back for your next shot, when you have those types of methods, you don't have to do anything. You don't have to remember anything on a daily basis. So they're entirely dependent on the effectiveness of the actual method itself. And we could put sterilization in that category as well. When a man has a vasectomy, there are, with any birth control method, there are failures, but quite low. The chances are quite slim. But again, after you have the procedure done and they test the semen to make sure that there's no sperm in it, really, that's it. You don't have to do anything. So some of the hormonal methods do have a user-dependent aspect of it, obviously. With the birth control pill, if you're not taking it regularly and really being diligent to do your part in that, then, there's both the method failure possibility that the method itself might fail, but there's this user failure component. Like if you don't take your pills regularly, correctly, if you use medication that can affect the effectiveness of it, or take some sort of supplement, or, just different things that can affect the effectiveness, there is this user-dependent aspect of that birth control. Now, with fertility awareness, it's entirely user-dependent. There's no medical aspect of it. There's nothing that is changing your actual body. So with fertility awareness, one of the greatest benefits of fertility awareness as a birth control method is that it doesn't affect your body at all. You don't have to make any changes. And barrier methods would also kind of, fall into that category. A condom doesn't make any difference to your hormonal status. It doesn't change anything in your body, but you have to actually put it on. So with condoms, then there is the user failure and method failure aspect of it. The condom itself could be faulty, but you could also use it incorrectly. And with fertility awareness, that's basically what is the basis of our discussion today. I just wanted to start by sharing a little bit about that just to get you thinking. I know this is something that many of us know, but we don't necessarily think about it in that way. We don't necessarily think about it in these terms. And, in the interviews that I've had with medical professionals, doctors in particular, the message that I've received over the years is that doctors are really trained to prioritize effectiveness over everything else. And even when you look at the research, again, effectiveness is the most paramount, even over and above the potential side effects that women can experience. And that's part of the reason why the side effects that women experience are often downplayed. But one of the things that this perspective assumes, it assumes that a woman's decision to get pregnant is completely black and white. It assumes that as women, we're either 100% on board with getting pregnant or 100% on board with avoiding pregnancy. And it doesn't acknowledge the very real gray area that exists in between. And that is what we're going to talk about today. Because with fertility awareness, there's a really big difference between user failure and method failure. Those are two different things. So, for example, if I actually accurately, actively checking my fertile signs every single day, I have educated myself about the rules. I have taken the time that I need to learn the method. So if I'm learning on my own, I've taken a minimum of 3 full cycles. That means period, ovulation, period, 3 times. So, for some women that would take 3 months, and for other women that would take several months because, not every woman's cycles are the same length. But, assuming that you've done everything to learn the method effectively and you have a very clear and specific understanding of the method itself, and you are following the method accurately. So following the method accurately means that you are actually tracking your cycles and you're tracking your fertile signs every day. And you're not just looking at it, you're actually noting it. So whether you use a charting app or, a paper chart or however you're charting, you're not just like checking, you're also writing it down. Those two things go together because even if you check, if you don't write it down, then you won't be able to remember. It's just the way that it is. So you're using the method accurately, you're doing your observations, you understand the rules, you actually understand them, and you're following them. And you also know what to do when in doubt or when you miss an observation because life isn't perfect. And, even the most diligent charter is going to have a day where she's traveling or something comes up and maybe she doesn't either do her observations or record them. So, knowing what to do when in doubt and actually doing that. So assuming that you're kind of following all those steps, then that would mean that you're using the method correctly. If the method fails you, then that's a method failure. But when you're using the method accurately, the research shows that it's up to 99.4% effective. The studies that have been done are on women who have been trained in a specific method, symptothermal, so a combination of cervical mucus and cervical position observations, as well as temperature. And these are women who were trained by instructors who were trained in a specific method. So these women really do know what they're doing. And so when the method failure, that's one thing. The chance of the method failing when you're actually using the method accurately is highly slim. But that's not how all of us use fertility awareness. And that's where the user failure comes in. So as a woman, when you're, learning fertility awareness and you start actually, having a protected sex in the pre-ovulatory phase before you really know the method, before you've really given yourself the minimum of 3 full cycles, before you've taken a class with an instructor or anything like that. Also, when you haven't really shifted your mindset from the rhythm method thinking to fertility awareness, which we'll talk a little bit about. So there's a lot of different things. And also, if you're not actually checking for mucus and you're not actually writing anything down, but you're having a protected sex, that's not using the method. So that's not that's not a method failure. That's a user failure. So, part of the reason that a lot of health practitioners don't really advise women to use fertility awareness or really discourage women from using it is because of because it's an entirely user-dependent method. So because they know that in order for the method to be effective, the woman really has to understand it and diligently do it. So I say these things because it's the truth, not because it's difficult to do. From my experience teaching women over the years, once women are taught the method, and they're given the opportunity to chart, for at least 2 to 3 full cycles. By the time my clients get to their second cycle with us together, they're quite confident, quite confident. So by the time they get to their third cycle and fourth cycle, they're really off to the races. So there is a bit of a learning curve like any other new skill, but it's really not that hard. It's fairly straightforward. And because we're talking about your cycle and you have, assuming that you're not like you're not in the postpartum period, or you don't have a significant endocrine issue or something like that, you're cycling then. And that means that, every new cycle you have an opportunity to reinforce what you've learned and to gain a deeper understanding of how your body changes as you approach ovulation, and how to identify your fertile window, and how to confirm ovulation, and all of those things. It gives you an opportunity to practice and to really gain comfort and confidence in those rules. So, the issue that I have, I suppose, with the medical establishment and how they typically downplay the effectiveness of fertility awareness and actively discourage women from using it is because it's based on this assumption that it's just too hard for us, right? Like fertility awareness is too difficult to learn, too complicated, and we're not smart enough or something like that to figure it out. So I think that really and truly what this boils down to is that for women who are serious about using fertility awareness, women who are tired of using hormones, perhaps had a negative reaction. Not all women have an intensely negative reaction immediately upon starting hormonal birth control, but a lot of women do. And a lot of women just find that they can't tolerate the side effects of the hormones. And so for these women and other women who just are not interested in the hormones and who are really interested in fertility awareness, it's really important for us then to have a good idea of what we can do to make it effective and have an adult conversation about what it looks like, and to really talk about some of the specific reasons why user failures happen. Like, what are some of the specific reasons why women do get pregnant when they're not trying to with the fertility awareness method, and why it's not necessarily a reflection of the method itself. So let's talk about this murky gray area that I think is really, really important to acknowledge when you're using fertility awareness. So I'm going to go through just some of the basic things that we need to, I suppose, wrap our heads around when we're wanting to use this method effectively for birth control. And I mean, the first thing I've already alluded to, understanding the rules. That's really, really important. It's easy to oversimplify fertility awareness and to assume that because it's your menstrual cycle, and most women have a menstrual cycle of reproductive age, that it's just necessarily simple. And so we want to be careful to not oversimplify it, to actually take the time to learn it and to really understand what the rules essentially are. And so the thing about it is that there's no one fertility awareness method that is universal. Fertility awareness is an umbrella term for understanding your body, your menstrual cycle, understanding how to identify your fertile window and how to confirm ovulation and how to predict when your period is coming. But ultimately, using fertility awareness as a method of birth control, under that umbrella, there are, many, many different fertility awareness-based methods. Some methods are mucus only. Some methods are temperature only. Some methods involve the use of devices. So there are some devices that are now, saying that this is a birth control. So you use the device itself as birth control, and the device tells you when you're fertile, when you're not. So all of these methods fall under the umbrella of fertility awareness-based methods. And so that's kind of the first thing to understand. But what these methods have in common, despite their differences, is that the purpose of whatever you're doing, whether it's entering your information into a device, checking your cervical mucus, measuring your temperature, checking your cervical position, or a combination of those things, using a fertility monitor to identify when you have your estrogen surge, all the different fertility awareness-based methods, what they have in common is that they're trying to help you identify the fertile window in your menstrual cycle. So they're trying to help you identify the days of cervical mucus, because really and truly when I say fertile window, what that means is that there's a period of time in your cycle before ovulation when you're producing cervical mucus. And when you have cervical mucus present and you have sex with a man, you can, the sperm from his ejaculate can survive in that mucus for up to 5 days. So you can have sex, several days before you get pregnant, or let me rephrase that because that is the wrong thing to say. But you can have sex several days before ovulation, and that one act of sex can cause pregnancy because the sperm are still alive and hanging out and waiting for ovulation. So really, there's this short window of time in the cycle where we can conceive, and the whole purpose of all of the different methods is to identify that time. And so, for instance, with the symptothermal method, when that's the method that I'm teaching women to identify the symptoms that we have, which are primarily cervical mucus, cervical position, and basal body temperature. So I'm helping my clients to, and you, of course, to figure out when that is. And primarily we do that by observing cervical mucus. And so we're checking for mucus every day. We're identifying when we have it. and understanding that any day that you have cervical mucus before ovulation is a fertile day. And the reason for that is because you can't predict when ovulation is going to happen. And cervical mucus can keep sperm alive for up to 5 days, and you produce it as you approach ovulation. So when you're seeing cervical mucus as you approach ovulation, it's an indication to you that your hormone levels are rising. So all of these things are happening in concert. It's like a symphony, and they're all happening together. And so the purpose of all of these methods is to identify that. So when I say that you need to understand the rules, it means that you have to understand what a fertile day is and what a not fertile day is. So, a fertile day is a day when you see cervical mucus as you approach ovulation. And that can look like clear, raw egg whites, clear, stretchy, raw egg whites. It can look like creamy white hand lotion. And it can also look like a really slippery sensation when you wipe yourself. So all of those things count as fertile days. And so, for instance, one of the things that I'm always stressing with my clients is that there's no such thing as more or less fertile. Like, that's not a real thing. I know a lot of women think it's a thing and talk about it as though it's a thing, but you can't be more or less pregnant. Every day of your cycle is either fertile or not, and it is black and white. And so when you can wrap your head around that, then you'll really be more successful in terms of using the method for birth control. And then also understanding that when you're using a method that combines signs, so combining, for instance, your mucus observations and your temperature, when you're trying to figure out, when ovulation happened, when you're trying to figure out, the end of your fertile window, like when that ends, then you're really looking for those signs to line up. So after ovulation, your cervical mucus would dry up, your temperature will rise, but those things have to match. And regardless of what method you're using, there's always a buffer period added to the end of that. So when your cervical mucus dries up, we're going to add, 3 days after that to make sure that you've actually ovulated and your temperature has actually risen and stayed high, and all of your signs essentially match up. So understanding that is paramount. Understanding the rules, taking time to learn them, picking an actual method, out of all the different fertility awareness methods, learning that and sticking to it is really important, because anyone who's listening who, has used a different method will know that the rules are different. And often I have conversations in my Facebook group, and women who are using a particular method will ask about, what are these temperature rules? For instance, I know Sensiplan has really detailed temperature rules, whereas the Just East method doesn't. And it doesn't make one valid over the other, but it's important to choose whatever method that you're using and understand those rules and follow them. Okay, so that's the first thing, actually understanding the rules. Really important if you're wanting to use fertility awareness or birth control. And I say that, obviously, it's that's not a surprise to anybody, but I have to say it because there's a lot of assumptions that we make, especially if you're not giving yourself the opportunity to learn the method for long enough. And also if you're not working with an instructor, then there's a lot of nuances that you'll end up learning sometimes the hard way, sometimes the easy way. But with fertility awareness, it's one of those things that it's really helpful to learn around other women who know more than you, because there's a lot of nuances that you just don't know because you haven't done it before. So, the second thing I think is extremely important. So first, learning the rules. But the second thing is to ditch the rhythm method thinking. I've talked about that before, and I'm sure I'll talk about it again. I talked about it in the book, The Fifth Vital Sign, because it's really important. And really, even this morning, I was answering some questions in my Facebook group, and I saw a comment that was like, it was a woman who was trying to conceive, and she was saying, how do I time it as close to ovulation as possible? Like, how do I know which day it's going to happen or something like that? And, even though, we can talk about fertility awareness, and I can share that it's, we produce cervical mucus as we approach ovulation, and that mucus keeps sperm alive for up to 5 days. Even though we talk about that, it really doesn't register because we have decades of this miseducation about our menstrual cycle. The miseducation that our cycles are basically, we just have to figure out what they're usually like, and then they're just going to repeat. We're going to ovulate around the same day. And also the idea that really it's just on ovulation day that you can get pregnant. So there's all these myths that kind of permeate the way that we think about things. And even as we learn fertility awareness, we still adhere to the myths. So, for example, how this comes into play when you're avoiding pregnancy is if you believe that your cycle is typically a certain length and you believe that ovulation typically happens at a certain time, I've seen it where you can actually have observations. So, for example, I think I might have mentioned this in one of the recent podcast episodes. I had a woman in my Facebook group, she saw cervical mucus early in her cycle. She saw it. day 7 or 8 or whatever it was. But she really didn't, it was like she didn't believe that she could have it that early or something like that, and was still timing sex based on, she was trying to conceive as well, but she was timing sex based on, no, but I ovulate on this day. So even though she was fully actually seeing it on that day, she was telling herself that she couldn't be seeing it because it doesn't match her preconceived notion of her menstrual cycle. Now, I'm not saying this to throw shade, because this is not this one particular person only. This is a common thing that basically when I'm working with my clients, this is one of the things that we have to work through together. Every single woman that I work with has some degree of what I call the rhythm method thinking. And how could we not, after coming out of the way that our culture tells us about our menstrual cycle? So the challenge with fertility awareness is that your cycle doesn't have to be perfect or regular. The biggest thing to wrap your head around when you use fertility awareness is that you can't predict ovulation. You can't. You can't predict when it's going to happen. You can't predict exactly what date it's going to happen on. And that's okay, because in order for fertility awareness to work, you don't need to be able to predict ovulation. So I think that's like the hardest thing. I was recently reading a book, and one of the things that it was saying about fertility awareness was that women who have irregular cycles can't use it. And it's not recommended unless a woman's cycles are really regular and predictable. Now, again, that is a myth. That's not actually true, even though it's a wide held belief, and you'll hear it a lot, you'll see it a lot. It's not true. If a woman's cycles are irregular, it doesn't mean that she can't use fertility awareness. The person who's making that statement doesn't understand that fertility awareness is different from the rhythm method. So with the rhythm method, the rhythm method is based on the idea that, as soon as you get a couple cycles under your belt, you're going to know when you ovulate. And so you're just going to, avoid sex at that time or whatever the case is. But for women who chart their cycles, especially women who've been charting their cycles for years, any woman who's been charting her menstrual cycles for over, a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, whatever the case is, will have experienced fluctuations in her cycle, even if her cycles are regular for the most part. And what that means is that, even if you're typically ovulating, like your cycles are, let's say around 28 to 32 days, and you're typically ovulating, day 15, 16, or whatever the case may be, over the course of your reproductive life, every single woman is going to have a cycle where she ovulates a little earlier or she ovulates a little bit later. It happens to every single woman. And whether it's happening, now, or whether, by the time you hit your early 40s, you're starting to see, an earlier ovulation, whatever the case is, all of us will have that. And so with fertility awareness, when I say ditch the rhythm method thinking, in order for you to be successful using fertility awareness as birth control, you have to acknowledge that it is possible for ovulation to happen early in any cycle, and it's possible for ovulation to happen late. And then what that means for you in terms of like the practical aspect of charting is you actually have to chart. So there's no like easy fix for that. What that means is that so for example, you have your period, and as your period is wrapping up, that's when you're going to start checking every day for your cervical mucus. And that sounds like a lot of work, but I'm sure you brushed your teeth this morning. It's always my example. As long as you can brush your teeth every day, you can chart your cycles. It's really not hard. It's just a habit that you get into once you do it consistently. To kind of summarize that point, in order to use fertility awareness, you have to actually check your signs. You have to check your fertile signs on a day-to-day basis, record what you see, and act upon it. You can't assume that because you've never ovulated before day 15 before, that if you see mucus on day 6, you are going to disregard that. If you see mucus on day 6 of your cycle or day 7 of your cycle, those are fertile days. And as soon as you start telling yourself, it can't be blah, 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 that's when the method fails. And what that means is you really didn't get the method. You didn't really understand that the goal of fertility awareness is never to predict ovulation and to base your decisions on what happened last cycle. It's always to base your decisions on what's happening right now. And similarly, if you have mucus around the time that you typically ovulate, and then it dries up and your temperature doesn't really shift and you're kind of confused, again, having unprotected sex during that time when you really don't know what's going on is not using the method correctly. That's a method, that's a user issue. You have to wait until your signs line up, until everything is clear and obvious. And when in doubt, you have to assume that you're fertile and wait until everything makes sense. So yes, number 2, ditch the rhythm method thinking and really challenge yourself to recognize that the goal of this method is on a day-to-day basis. Am I fertile or not today? A third point that is really, really important is what I alluded to earlier. Understanding that this decision of whether or not we want to get pregnant is not black and white. The use of hormonal birth control and the way that basically the conversation that we have about birth control in our culture is built on the assumption that as women, we're 100% trying to get pregnant or 100% not trying to get pregnant, and there's no in between. Now, in my years and years of working with women, I can tell you that most women are not like on the end of the spectrum, as strange as that might sound. Some women are definitely like zero, like I am not, there's no pregnancy at all. Some women. And some women are definitely, I've been trying to conceive for 6 months. I definitely want a baby right now. But the majority of us are not like on the ends, even if it sounds strange to you. If you're on one of the ends, it might sound really strange to you to think like, how could you not be like one or the other? But a lot of us aren't. And unless we have that conversation and acknowledge that we're not all on the ends, then we can't actually have an adult conversation about the fertility awareness method. So what I've seen over the years is that there's times when, women will get conceive who, use fertility awareness. And there's a lot of different complicated reasons for that. There are a number of women who use, whatever birth control method. So let's say they're using hormonal birth control and they come off of it and they're avoiding. They're not trying to get pregnant. So they're avoiding pregnancy. They're using fertility awareness. They're not getting pregnant. So what that means is that they're, identifying their fertile window. They're not having unprotected sex during their fertile window, and they're having unprotected sex outside of their fertile window. So they're having unprotected sex like post-ovulation after they've followed the rules, and they're having sex sometimes pre-ovulation. They're following the rules. And after several months of this, they actually, this is super common. So if you've had this thought, you're not the only one. That's why I'm calling it out on air. But a lot of women start to actually wonder if they're capable of getting pregnant and start to worry that they're not getting pregnant. Even though they're using the method and even though the method is effective, we have been so programmed to believe that any active sex is going to involve pregnancy that there's a part of their brain that's still like, why am I not pregnant? Even if they're not talking about it, even if it's kind of like it's kind of under the surface and they're not actually acknowledging it, but it's a real thing. And so there's a percentage of women then who get pregnant using fertility awareness because they actually take a risk on a day, like a day basically that is a fertile day. So a day that they see mucus, but it's like, oh, I only saw it once, or I didn't have that much, or whatever they're telling themselves, but it's a fertile day. If you see mucus once in your pre-ovulatory phase, that's a fertile day. If you see a little bit of mucus that's kind of creamy before ovulation, that's a fertile day. But, like I said, I've been around this field for so long. I've had so many conversations with women, and this is a thing. So back to our woman. So, on some level, she's questioning it. She's been on birth control all this time. She's using fertility awareness. It's actually working, but she's thinking it's only working because I'm infertile. And I think as women too, I can relate to that because I didn't ever try to have a baby until I was almost 30. And so there was definitely a part of me that was like, can I even get pregnant? I've never got pregnant before. Can I? It's natural. It's a natural thing for us to be concerned about it. And then, these women take a risk, meaning they have sex on a fertile day, and they get pregnant. Can you blame the method? No, you can't blame the method. But we have to have a conversation about this very real continuum, how all of us are not 100%. And there's all these different reasons that play into our behavior. Human behavior is really complicated. And so sometimes the reasons we do the things we do are not, like, it's not even to the surface. Like, we haven't even really had that conversation with ourselves about it, about our fears, about our fear. What if I can't get pregnant? And so I try. The fear that, like, this method doesn't really work. But then you get pregnant by having sex on a fertile day and you're like, oh, wow, the method was effective. And sometimes we do those things almost to prove it to ourselves, but it's not necessarily a conscious thing. So that's one example. And I would say another example is quite literally, like, having a baby is not an easy decision. And, a lot of us wait until the stars align perfectly, right? Like, you've got the partner, you've got the job, you've got the home, you've got the secure job. But not all of us are in that position where we have the perfect everything lined up. And, I think the United States is a good example of that. There's no mat leave. There's nothing. Having a baby means, for a lot of women, they have to worry if they're still going to keep their jobs. And It's a huge financial commitment. I have 2 kids at daycare. This is not like an easy black and white decision. Sometimes we really want a baby, but our life doesn't really match that stage. And so we're avoiding, but we're not like 100% on that spectrum. You know what I mean? Like we're somewhere in the middle. And so that means that from what I've seen working with women over the years is that some women are on the zero, like there's no pregnancy here. If I get pregnant, I'm going to terminate it type of certainty, like I'm on the zero spectrum. And for these women, their charts, you could put them up in a textbook. Everything is charted. Everything is like they're on the ball. Everything meticulous, beautiful, brilliant, perfect. You can use any word, insert word for what their charting habits are like. And they're very specific about how they're going to manage their fertile window. They have a plan in place. They've had conversations with their partner. Many of them will opt to abstain entirely from sex, even with a condom. They're not having it. Or they'll have sex with a condom and withdraw. Like their partner will have a condom on the whole time and withdraw with the condom on. So these are women who are like no risk, zero risk. There's no risk. And I can resonate with those women. When I'm not trying, I'm avoiding. And I am very much like that. But every woman isn't like that. So some women, are like there's different ways to manage the fertile window. And I'm not saying there's right and wrong. I'm saying that there's different levels of comfort. There's different levels of risk. So some women are, use withdrawal, and withdrawal is up to 96% effective. And many women use it successfully for the majority of their reproductive lives. So again, I'm not saying anything. I'm negative about any of these methods. I'm literally just trying to state what I've seen. But other women, that's too much of a risk. Like they're not willing to even think about that. And so I say this because part of using fertility awareness effectively and part of having this method work for you is to literally have that adult conversation with yourself. The first thing is to figure out where you are on that spectrum. It's okay if you're not at 100% no babies or 100% baby, because most of us are not there. There's a percentage of us for whom we are actively avoiding. But if we were to get pregnant, we would have the baby. So I think it's really important to acknowledge that and to acknowledge how that position on that spectrum can influence your behavior, even in a subtle way that you're not necessarily aware of. The only way to bring that to awareness to your attention is to actually think about it, talk about it, acknowledge it, talk to your friends about it, talk to your partner about it, talk to yourself about it, journal about it. Like figure out, where do I sit? If there was a spectrum in front of me with like 0 babies on one end and 100% I wanted a baby last week on the other end, where am I? And if you're clear on where you are in that spectrum, then you can start to understand how where you are on that spectrum could influence how you're going to chart your cycles and how you're going to basically, what is going to influence your behavior. And so that brings me back to kind of the way that we started this episode, which is user failure, method failure. With fertility awareness, we have to be adults about it. We have to acknowledge all of these factors, because with fertility awareness, like the safety net is you. With a condom, the safety net is the condom, as long as you put it on, right? With the IUD, the safety net is the IUD. Like you don't have to think about it. And even if you have this undercurrent of feelings, conflicted feelings inside, you've got the safety net. With fertility awareness, if you have an undercurrent of conflicted feelings around whether or not you're ready to have a baby and all of that, you know what I mean? Like it's all you. And so really that's why I keep saying like grown-up conversations, adult conversations. This is a method that forces us to talk to our partners. Even though there's always a chance of pregnancy with any type of birth control you use, with fertility awareness, that reality is a lot more in our face. It's a lot more apparent. And therefore, we really have to, all of a sudden it occurs to us like, wow, what would I do if I got pregnant? Or what would I do if I was in the middle of my fertile window and the condom broke or my partner didn't withdraw? And this is what the conversations we really should be having anyways. If you're having sex with another person, these are conversations that you should at least be having with yourself, but ideally be having with your partner. So that brings me to the last point that I want to talk about today, which is, all of the things we've talked about bring us to the point of, okay, so you're using fertility awareness for birth control. You understand the rules. You have gotten your head out of the rhythm method thinking. You have done this little exercise with yourself, so you know where you are on the continuum, and you've acknowledged how that could affect your behavior. You've determined the level of risk that you're willing to tolerate. And so now we have to decide, how are you going to manage your fertile window? So there's a few options, right? When you're in your fertile window, you can opt to not have any sex, nothing, zero, nothing, no touching, no nothing. You can opt to have outer course, if we want to call it that, but no penis and vagina intercourse. So you can opt to do everything but, right? But no penis and vagina, oral sex, fingering, all kinds of fun, but no penis and vagina. You can opt to use barrier methods. So you can opt to use condoms. You can use a diaphragm or a cervical cap. You can opt for withdrawal. And you can use a combination of those. So you could use a condom with your cervical cap. You could use withdrawal with your diaphragm, whatever you're comfortable with. But really, those are essentially your options. Have I left anything out? I don't know. But those are your options. Really, it comes down to a conversation between you and your partner. Some couples are really open to using condoms. Some couples are not. Some couples are really open to withdrawal. Some couples are not. Some couples are really like that idea of combining. So using one method with another to achieve effectiveness. And at the end of the day, in order to use any of those options effectively, you have to really understand what perfect use looks like, using those methods correctly, understanding that you can't use coconut oil with condoms or the condoms will break. You can't use oil with condoms. You have to use silicone-based or water-based lubricants with condoms. Understanding that if you're using withdrawal, he has to withdraw and he has to ejaculate away from your vulva. It can't be anywhere close to that. Understanding that if you use a cervical cap or a diaphragm that has to be inserted previously, and these devices are intended to be used with spermicides. So researching safe spermicides that are not going to disrupt your vaginal flora and cause you to have all kinds of issues and irritations and problems. But really, again, this is a way for us to just set ourselves up for success. And you can't have that conversation or make that decision in the moment. When you're already having sex, it's too late to have a conversation about how you're going to manage your fertile window. This is something you have to figure out before, and you have to involve your partner in that. And the two of you have to come to an understanding of what is going to be, what fits for you. What meets your needs as a couple. What type of birth control, what type of way of managing your fertile window is going to work for you. And every couple is different. If you are part of any fertility awareness groups, if you have any friends who use fertility awareness and you have this conversation, you'll notice that there's a huge range of how women manage their fertile window. And that's okay. And that's where the continuum, reflecting back to the previous point, that's where the continuum comes in. We have to know where we are on the continuum. We have to know what level of risk we're willing to tolerate. We have to know what we're comfortable with. We're not all comfortable with the same things. That's why we have all these different methods. But at the end of the day, I share this with you because with fertility awareness, I know that for a lot of women, this is what resonates with them. They don't want hormones. They want to be able to understand their bodies, and they love that idea of just, there's just a small window of fertility, and if I can just figure out how to manage that, then I don't have to subject my body to all this stuff. I can just figure out what to do during that small window of my cycle and then just enjoy sex uninhibited. And one of the benefits of not going on hormonal birth control is enjoying the full expression of your libido and your sexuality, because hormonal birth control does suppress testosterone, which does have an impact on libido. And whether you're aware of it or not, all of us are affected by that if we're on it. It's how it works. The purpose of hormonal birth control is to disrupt the endocrine system. And therefore, when you use it, it does. And so again, that it's about informed consent. If you know that and you're comfortable with that for a period of time, that's fine. But for those of us who are choosing fertility awareness, really and truly, you can be successful with it, but we have to let go a lot of our preconceptions in order to make this work. So I'm just going to do a quick recap of basically what I have seen over the years to be most important, what you need to know when you want to use fertility awareness effectively and how to make it work for you, using it for birth control to set yourself up for success, really. So the first thing is understanding the rules. That should go without saying, but I am saying it because we really have to understand the rules, understand that there's no one universal fertility awareness method, and you really have to pick one. Pick a fertility awareness-based method and learn the rules and follow those rules and really be clear on it. Study it like a class or take a class with a certified instructor. Number 2, ditching the rhythm method thinking. Your cycle is not predictable. Ovulation is not predictable. throw away, like write it on a piece of paper, like ovulation is predictable, and then like rip it up and throw it in the garbage. Like we need to throw that idea in the garbage. When you're using fertility awareness, you must understand that ovulation can happen earlier or later in your cycle. And the goal is not to predict it. The goal is to actually look at your fertile signs on a day-to-day basis to determine if today is fertile or not. So on any day of your cycle, you should be able to look your partner in the eye and tell them, are you fertile today or not? Yes or no. There's no middle. There's no gray. Yes or no. Okay. Number 3, understanding the continuum, recognizing that the idea that we're all either fully on board with pregnancy or fully avoiding is not real. It's a fictional idea. This is not human nature. The decision of whether or not to become pregnant, when to become pregnant is very, very complicated. And some of us let that decision up to chance. Some of us take risks that we know it's a fertile day, but we have sex on that day because it's just too much of a decision to actually make because it's a very complicated decision. And so whether or not you can personally resonate with that idea right now, know that it's a real thing. So in order to be successful, you have to figure out where are you on the continuum and how could that affect your decisions day to day of how you're using this method. And the last one, know how to manage your fertile window. So with everything kind of that we've said, that really builds to this point, because this is the practical application. This is what's going to make or break the effectiveness of your using fertility awareness. How are you going to manage your fertile window? And so ultimately, you have to decide, what are you comfortable with? What is your partner comfortable with? What makes the most sense for both of you? And really and truly, that's going to guide you. That's super important. And then on top of that, using your chosen method of birth control correctly every time. So that brings us to the end of today's episode. I really want to hear your thoughts. I want to know how you are dealing with this, what types of conversations you've had with your partner, how you're managing your fertile window, and where you are on that spectrum. And so make sure to join us in the Fertility Friday Facebook group. You'll find us over at fertilityfriday.com/community. And I just want to thank you for taking some time to listen to today's episode and spend some time with me today. You'll find the show notes for today's episode over at fertilityfriday.com/244. This is a topic that I'm super passionate about, and I go through in a lot of detail in my new book, The Fifth Vital Sign, Master Your Cycles and Optimize Your Fertility. If you haven't grabbed your copy yet, it is available on Amazon in paperback and ebook formats, soon in audio format. Still working on it. Almost done. Really excited about it. And you can actually get the first chapter for free over at thefifthvitalsignbook.com. So thank you so much for spending some time with me today. This was a lot of fun. And I look forward to hearing your thoughts and comments in our Facebook group. And so with that, I will say goodbye. And until next time, as always, be well and happy charting.